Hi everybody, Jane here, and today I want to talk to you about third-person limited point of view. So what is third-person limited? Third-person limited is when a story is told as kind of as if you are a telepathic parrot sitting on somebody's shoulder and you can only hear that person's thoughts. So it's kind of an over-the-shoulder view of what the character who is talking can see, or who you're following can see, and what they're thinking, and you are limited to just one person's head at a time. You can change perspectives, but you can't have multiple perspectives within the same scene. Also, that person and the narrator necessarily are limited by what we know about the current situation. You can't have and things like, and 5 years from now, he would really regret this decision. But for the moment, you can't do that because third person limited is just what people know. Third person limited is one of the more popular styles to write in. It is personally my favorite because it is not quite as intimate as first person, and I don't have to worry so much about voice. In romance, I think it is very natural, and it is the one I see the most because you can have her perspective and his perspective, and then her perspective again. So she comes in the scene, this is how she's feeling, this is what she's thinking, this is what happens, then his reaction to it, then what he does, and her reaction back. I love it for romance. I think it's the best choice for romance. It is very nice to write in, and it is very nice to read in because you can see multiple things. So what are the advantages of it besides that? You don't have to worry quite as much about voice when telling a story. You don't have to be as entertaining because it doesn't matter so much if they like the main characters, like that's not the narrator. You can have an unlikable or even a terrible third person narrative character, whereas if you have that in first person, it's really hard to read a book that is being told by somebody who's just awful and has awful thoughts that you just can't agree with. Also, you aren't as limited as in first person with what can be said. You can always pop into a different character's head and show things that are off screen to the main character. Again, in romance, that's very useful so that you know what the guy's thinking, what the girl's thinking, and how they're kind of screwing things up in the background for each other without knowing it. And you get everybody's intention, so it's not just, oh, he's a real jerk acting like a jerk. Well, you know why he's acting like a jerk. One of the things that I think is challenging about third person is to not head hop too much. You don't want to have a ton of characters that you head hop in if you can avoid it because it gets really, really confusing really fast. So a lot of the issues are similar to the ones in first person, like you can't show anything that your third person character doesn't know who you're following. But on the other hand, you don't necessarily have to reveal everything like you do in first person. That person can die, so you don't have that issue. But you do have some of the limitations as far as, just scope of the story. And it's not as close. So it's not as deep, it's not as, connected. I don't connect with a third person limited character the way I do with the first person. So there is that distance. You are hearing a story about somebody. He said, he did, she said, she did, she thought. It's just not as intimate as a first person. So these are kind of the things that I think are important to keep in mind when you're doing third person limited. Is this a story that needs multiple points of view? Because if it is, that's probably your go-to. Is that common in the genre? With romance, for instance, that is what I see most of, and I really like it. So if you're writing romance, that's a good way to go. You can get away with first person, but I like third person way better. Am I trying to hide something from my reader? And if you do that, third person is better than first person. Am I wanting to put my character in danger and have the reader worried about whether they're going to make it? Assuming that that's appropriate to your genre, you can't do that in romance. But assuming that's appropriate to your genre, third person's a good way because you can kill off a third person narrative character a lot easier than first person. Also, when you switch perspectives, you don't have to worry about narrator voice, you just have to worry about character voice. And that's a lot different. It's a lot less in depth, even though you've got a lot of dialogue going on. It's not, since so much of the information is going to be coming out as narrative instead of just dialogue, you don't have to worry as much about the voice because the narrator's voice is their own voice. Speaking of voice, that is one thing to think about though, is because the narrator is, it's a exposition basically, you're telling stuff, you have to be careful about not info dumping because you are not in the character's head, you're not in their voice, and you can't make an info dump as entertaining. Just to be really careful with info dumps when you are in third person. When you're doing reveals or flashbacks or anything like that, that's a lot harder to do as a writer in third person than it is in first person. You know, in first person, you're telling your story in the voice of the character. In third person, it's narrative, so it's not as entertaining for the most part. So relaying information can be a lot more challenging in third person. Another thing in third person that I think, again, as a writer can get confusing is making sure that your timelines add up, especially for alternating perspectives. Like, if character A has 1 day pass and character B has 5 days pass, that can be really confusing to the reader. So I think there are definitely challenges because you're coordinating more characters you generally than you are in first person. Most first person books are written in the point of view of one character. Not always, but most. Whereas with third person limited, you almost always have multiple characters. So I do think there are challenges in that way of coordinating with characters, and also just keeping in your perspective because you're in third, so it's easy to say, oh, well, this other person, not the person whose point of view you're in, thought this or did this because, and that's not appropriate. I've seen that a lot, especially in first drafts from newer writers where I'm sitting there and it's obviously in third person limited, but then they're not head hopping, they're not like going to another person's perspective, they're just having the narrator interpret the other person's mood or actions or motivations, and it's like, but you're not in their head, you don't know. So you got to be careful of that as a writer, that you're being consistent, and if you're in third person limited, you stay in third person limited. If you're in a romance, for instance, and your point of view character is your girl, she can't know her best friend's motivation unless her friends tells her. She can't be like, well, and Sally went and she did that because she was jealous of me. Unless Sally said she was jealous of you, you can't say that Sally did that because she was jealous. Unless we know she's jealous, unless she said she's jealous. Your character can think that she did it because she was jealous, but you can't state it as an absolute fact. So those are kind of the things that can get tricky with third person point of view. Like I said, it is my favorite. I recommend writing in it. Another thing that's nice is, especially I think in historical novels or in novels where you may not be able to have all the background you might need to tell the story, I feel like you can get away with a lot more as a third person narrative. I was telling the story in my video on first person narrative, but my book, The Alpha's Daughter, one of the challenges I had is it is written in the time of Henry VIII, and there were certain words that they would have used for things, and I feel like I couldn't copy that voice. My story, if you read it, is very much like it does take place in the courts of Henry VIII, but the narrative is very modern, and probably the dialogue's a little more modern than it should be, but definitely, absolutely 100%, this is not written in the actual language of Henry VIII, because if it was, it would be really hard to read. Even if you do first person, you can kind of get away, since it is fiction, with a little bit of that, but it's a lot more challenging to make it feel real if you're not using kind of the tone and voice from the period. Whereas in third person point of view, that's not as much of an issue, and you don't necessarily have to use the exact words. that they would have used for things in a narrative. You can describe something as something that maybe didn't exist exactly back then, or you can just be a little bit more broad. I know in certain time periods, for instance, certain colors hadn't been labeled yet. But if I have a color, I don't worry about it, and I just tell you what color it is, even if that color wasn't recognized as its own color at the time. Or, if I have a narrative about, sexuality, it's a lot harder to pick out what a person would call their own body parts than it is to, as a third person narrator, name body parts. So, just keep those things in mind. If you want to see some really good examples of third person limited, I would say look at almost any romance novel out there. A lot of them have that and are very good at doing it. So, third person, I think, is one that you see the most. They're easy to find, and I think it's the easiest one to write in if you're writing a complex story. It is also one that takes a lot of work to learn, though, because most writers who I meet who are new tend to do first person because that's conversational, it's how we write. So it does take a little bit of work to learn to do the he and she in limited and not omniscient. And omniscient is going to be what we're going to talk about next, which is very similar, but that'll be the next video. So I'd love to hear your comments on third person. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you write in it? How many perspectives do you feel is too much? Anything you want to tell me about what you think about third person, I'm eager to hear. If this video was helpful, please hit like, and if you'd like more content, hit subscribe. Thanks.